Hi, I'm Teresa from Phoenix Gate Crafts, and today I'm talking about the material you're choosing for your needles. So this is a surprisingly complex topic, and it's something that seems to affect knitters a little bit more than crocheters. Mostly because with crocheters, there is a limited amount of time that any loops are going to be spending on your needle. So in a crochet hook, at most of the time you've only got 3 or 4 loops on your needle. At most you usually are only having about an inch worth of stitches on your hook at any given time. So when you're crocheting, you've always got a different loop on your hook because it's the loop for the next stitch, and then you do several loops for that next stitch, and then you pull through and you only have a different loop on your stitch. So even though crocheters definitely have preferences for the material that their hook is made out of, most of that has more to do with the grip than the actual material of the hook itself. There are definitely preferences, but honestly, if you give a crocheter a hook that's not from their preferred material, it's not usually the deal breaker. But the handle can be. Now that that's kind of really quickly taken care of, let's talk about knitting. So unlike crochet, where at most you've only got a handful of loops on your hook at any given time, with knitting, you've got all of your loops on your needles at all times, and you have to go all the way around. So first of all, when you're choosing your knitting needles, you need to know what style of knitting you're doing, because you could be doing straight needles, which typically have an end kind of like this, in which case your stitches on your hook are going down your needle, and then as you knit back, they're coming back. You can also have DPNs, where you have a point on each end, and these ones you are literally going, your stitches go literally all the way across. You can also have fixed circulars, where you are literally going all the way around over and over and over again. So for these, it isn't just a matter of the material your tips are made from, it's also the material that your cord is made from that matters. Then finally, you have interchangeable needles. And I'm going to do a separate video talking about the cost-benefit analysis of interchangeable knitting needles, but it's a similar thing to fixed circulars, where you're going all the way around. But now, in addition to the material of the needle and the cord, you also have to consider the join for this needle and how smooth it is and how effective it is keeping together. Now we'll go into that bit more when we talk about actual interchangeable circular needle sets, but for the purposes of this video, we're talking mostly about the material for your tips, as well as what to look for in a cord, just briefly. So once you've figured out what style of knitting you are using, which is primarily going to be dictated by the projects that you are using, and you're not stuck to any one particular type. As you can see, I have every single type because I've tried every single type, and that experimentation is how I found what works for me. And especially if you're a beginner, but even if you're advanced, trying new needles and seeing if something different works for you might save you some time, effort, and frustration in the long run. And I do suggest it for intermediate knitters, just because over time your knitting style changes a little bit. You know, if you develop arthritis, it's going to be different than when you were a young whippersnapper picking it up for the first time. I notice that now that I've been knitting for 3 years, my gauge has loosened a little bit, and I am not so hardcore against wooden needles as I used to be, though I still do prefer metal. But that brings us to the 2 main types of materials. You have wood and you have metal. which also brings you down to plastic, polymer, or resin needles. I don't have any of those. I haven't really tried any. I did have a plastic set that very much didn't work for me, but I have since gotten rid of those, so I don't have them on display. A lot of those plastic types or resin needles are used for ergonomic needles, which have a limited amount of efficacy. They work for certain people, but a large portion I've noticed don't find any difference with ergonomics versus non-ergonomics, because when you're knitting, your hands go on top of your project and on top of your stitches, which in terms of the feel of it doesn't matter quite so much. But the big difference is with the tips of the needles themselves, as well as wear and tear. So let's start off by talking about wood. There are many different styles of wood. I believe this one is a Knit Picks style of beech wood, where they take several different kinds of wood, basically in different colors, some of it natural, some of it dyed, and then they glue them together, and let's see if I can get this into focus. They basically glue the different colors of wood together, and then they sand them down into the shape and size of the particular needle that you are purchasing. And so each one is unique in terms of the actual color composition. And they are then very highly finished. This is very smooth and feels very plasticky, even though it is wood. So this one actually feels very smooth. But you can have less finished woods like this one, which are just some kind of wood cut with the grain, then it's sanded and it's got some light finishing to it. This one has more texture to it. And then you can also have bamboo. And I do believe this is a Chow bamboo knitting needle. This one is a little bit more blunt than the other two, as you can see by the tips when I hold them side by side. This one's a naturally thinner needle, but so this is the thinnest tip. But this one's also fairly smooth because it is sanded down, but there is in all of these a little bit of natural texture because of the grain of the wood. And because there's that little bit of texture that kind of grabs onto your yarn, a lot of people who are looser knitters really like wooden needles. Also, people who are using slicker yarns tend to like wooden needles because of that natural grippiness. But when I was first starting to knit, I was very tight. I was a tense little bugger, and I would really pull on my yarn. So that grabbiness actually wound up not working so well because it would fray my yarn a little bit. That's why I prefer metal needles, which tend to be much, much more slick. So if you're very tight, you'll probably really like metal. Also, wood tends to bend like naturally. Look at this. It's not very much pressure because this is a very thin wooden needle. And so if you're putting too much pressure on it, this thing can snap. If you sit on this, it is very likely to snap. And so realize that wooden needles often are a little bit less expensive than metal, but there is natural wear and tear that happens. They are more likely to break, and over time with heavy use, you will actually wear off the finish and actually wear off some of your needle. So these will thin over time and become a different gauge. So just be aware that wooden needles, although they do last a long time if they are very well made, do have limits to how long they can last. Compared to that, metal needles don't wear so much. You can wear off the finish, which you can't really see because my quality of camera is not particularly good. But you can wear off the metal finish, leaving whatever metal is underneath at the core. Metal needles tend to be a little bit heavier in the hand, and we're talking like a gram or two. We're not talking ounces or pounds. That really makes very much of a difference. Like if you're having trouble picking this up, you have some other issues going on, and I recommend seeing a doctor. They tend to be a little bit on the colder side. Wood tends to retain a little bit of heat, but metal is a conductor, so it will actually take some heat from your hand. So if you have arthritis, this might not be a particularly good idea for you. However, there is no bending this. If you get a really cheap metal like aluminum, you might be able to bend it with enough pressure. And some people are allergic to things like nickel plating, so you want to be careful if you do have that kind of sensitivity. They aren't likely to break, but if you get a particularly thin and cheap set like this, there is a chance that you can bend it, and you can make it permanently bend with enough pressure over enough time. So just be cautious about that. However, more expensive needles such as ChiaoGoo are made out of stainless steel, which typically doesn't have the bending or the wear and tear issue. I typically say when I recommend ChiaoGoo needles that because of the stainless steel, they are expensive, but they are literally the last needles that I am ever going to purchase. So expense can indicate quality a little bit with knitting needles. And regardless of whether you are getting bamboo or metal, I still recommend ChiaoGoo very, very much. So if you are using metal needles and you are finding that you are sliding your stitches off way too easily and they just keep like falling off and moving and slipping inside of your hand with your needle, that means you're a much looser knitter and that you probably actually want to go with wood. So like most things, whether you're dealing with wood or metal is kind of a spectrum. Wood is one end and metal is the other, and a lot of people choose whether they're using wood or metal needle based on the project that they're doing. So if they are doing something where they want a slipperier needle, so if they're dealing with wools or something that's a little bit stickier or rougher, they're probably going to choose more of a metal, versus if they are dealing with cotton or a slicker material, they're probably going to want to do wood. You're not restricted on one or the other, and a lot of people purchase needles based on the project that they are getting needles for. That is completely valid, and honestly, if you're planning to make multiple of that type of thing, purchasing based on the project is very wise. And lastly, a quick note on cords for your circular needles. So as you can see, you want a cord that when you turn it into the center, like how you're going to be knitting with it, it looks the way that you want it to look while you're knitting. You want a certain amount of flexibility, and you want a certain amount of strength to it. Because yes, you can break these cords, especially if you're using the wrong size of cord and you're really doing a strong bend right here at the joint, you can wear this enough that it will eventually break. There could also be defects. Wood is known for having a defect in the wood grain that makes it more prone to breaking. You could have a weakness in your metal needle that makes it bend a little bit more easily. And there could be defects in the cord or the join that make it break. If this ever happens, contact the supplier you purchased it from and see if you can't get a refund or a replacement, because that isn't normal. Most of them work pretty well, regardless of what you're getting. However, there are really cheap cords that I highly, strongly suggest against. I don't have any because I got rid of all mine, but if you're ever knitting and you wind up with a situation like this, or a situation kind of like where it stands up when you're going and you're holding them like this, I mean, I have to really twist this to get it to stay, but there are some really cheap plastic knitting needles where they just kind of do that loop in the middle. You can try to fix this by getting a pan of boiling water and just dumping your entire needles into that pan of boiling water and letting it sit for 30 seconds to a minute. Then you fish them out, being very careful not to burn yourself. And then you pull them tight, and they should look like this, at least until you start knitting. I found that by doing that, they tend to curl up and get in the way really quickly, like within a minute or two of resuming knitting. I hate that. That is my big no-no. That is my deal breaker when it comes to circular knitting needles. I hate that. Clover knitting needles, the cord does that and it drives me insane. I would steer clear of that. Though they have really good tips and they are really good if you're getting straight needles or DPNs. They're just not particularly good at circular knitting needles. That's why I recommend ChiaoGoo, Haya, Addi. They're a little bit more expensive, but I really don't have that issue kind of no matter what happens. It's just a matter of twisting it back and you'll get it straightened out. Not a problem. I never have to do the hot water method on these needles. So that is something to consider. And like my recommendation for crocheters, how do you find what works for you? Well, you get samples. You get a fixed circular of ChiaoGoo's to see if you like it. You get the DPN of the wooden set that you want. You get one of whatever it is and see if you like that. That way you can determine if purchasing a set is worth it for you. And I am going to talk about what to look for in sets in particular and doing a cost-benefit analysis of whether it's worth it. Anyway, I hope you found this helpful. Good luck finding your knitting needles or your crochet hooks. Bye.